Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mā ki tēnei kōrero. Good afternoon and welcome to this NRCoP webinar on navigating regulatory landscapes, foresights to advance regulatory practice and governance. I'm Lisa Docherty, Director of the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative here in New Zealand, and I'm here today as a member of the NRCoP committee for ANZSOG. We're here today live from Maritime New Zealand's boardroom in Wellington, overlooking to my left, the Wellington Harbour. We've got an online audience today of over 400 joining us from across New Zealand, Australia and beyond, so welcome to you all. While we're coming to you from Te Whanganui Atara and acknowledge the mana whenua here in Ngāti Tama, I'd also like to acknowledge First Peoples from all our countries and pay my respects to them. We honour their wisdom and their stewardship of traditional lands, waters and customs which enrich us all. Before I introduce our speakers, a little bit of housekeeping, or as my colleague Grant said, a little bit of reading your rights. All the webinars are recorded and will be made available on the ANZSOG YouTube channel, and there'll be some short videos of key points that will be able to be accessed through social media platforms too. We'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom for questions, and please do use this. We'll leave a good chunk of time at the end of our speakers to answer questions. And this is going to be a hard job for me. These two can talk quite hard, but I really want to make space for you all to get a word in. If you like the look of another question that someone's asked, you can upvote it, and we'll attempt to get to as many of them as we can during the Q&A. We'll also ask our presenters to respond in writing to a selection of questions that we don't get to during the session, and this resource will be added to the webinar recording and will also be available on the NRCoP website. If the Zoom webinar live stream cuts out, please stay with us on the webinar, and the NRCoP team will be working in the background to rectify the issue and get the live stream back up to you ASAP. If your internet connectivity drops out, please restart your internet and rejoin the Zoom webinar. So today's session explores some of the challenges faced by regulators generally and specifically in terms of how and when they might use different sites to advance their regulatory practice. It's titled Navigating Regulatory Landscapes, Foresights to Advance Regulatory Practice and Governance. I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. On my left, Dr. Grant Pink, who is the academic advisor to ANZSOG National Regulators Community of Practice and a long-standing friend and supporter of G-Reg here in New Zealand. Grant has more than 25 years of regulatory and enforcement experience, spanning practitioner, management, executive, academic and consultancy roles, operating at local, state, national and international levels. Grant's written more than 30 articles for practitioner and academic publications in the areas of regulatory practice, capability building, networking and collaboration. Grant's research and consultancy practice considers how regulators build, maintain and sustain regulatory capability and capacity. On my right, Rob Warner has worked across New Zealand government for over 30 years and is a highly experienced strategist, certified strategic foresight and applied complexity practitioner. Rob's studies have involved strategic negotiation and strategic foresight. For the last 6 years, Rob has worked closely with Maritime New Zealand Board and Executive Leadership Team, advising on enterprise and regulatory strategy development and ways to transform complexity into opportunity. Rob's part of a growing international network of government foresight professionals, a member of the New Zealand G-Reg community, and a passionate advocate of applied strategic decision support and sense-making frameworks to help navigate uncertainty in a range of regulatory and policy settings. I know Grant and Rob well, but as experts with quite different specialisations. So I would go to Grant to talk about regulatory capability and especially press him in the context of G-Reg and how networks actually work. And I quite often go for Rob for a nice coffee and a chat about foresight and futurist mindsets. And today's the first time that I thought of them coming together. So before we start, I just want to ask how you came to be working together. Start with you, Rob.
Well, that's a great question. Thanks, Lisa. I first came across Grant at a G-Reg conference in Wellington a few years ago, and it was a great meeting of minds, I thought, and an opportunity to exchange pins, which I'm sure Grant will expand on.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it was 2018, the G-Reg conference. I was lucky enough to be the international keynote speaker. And in the break, Helen, your colleague, came up to me and she gave me the pin. She gave me the Mania pin. And she was telling me the story behind the land, the sea, the air, and how it's a protectionist type of symbol, which is important for regulators. And we were halfway through the conversation, and Rob comes, she didn't really get it into my pocket. Then Rob comes in and says, it's great, let's have a chat. And he wanted to take off his own pin and give it to me. So I said, I'm fine, thanks. But I think that just sort of shows what Rob's like. It was a very first meeting. We had a great chat, very, very keen to share, and we've just kept doing it since.
So what was the catalyst for this particular collaboration?
Wow. This feels like a confessional. I don't even have told Rob this. After having met Rob and his name kept popping up, and then I think it was on LinkedIn or something like that, I saw Rob was over in Oxford doing something about foresighting and strategy, and I thought, and I just kept monitoring his posts and what he did, and I thought it was fascinating stuff. Even though it was probably anchored more in the policy space, I could see the regulatory utility, and we just kept in touch and had conversations. But preparing for this, my notes go back to December when we were starting to talk about Hindsight. So yeah, it's been a little while in the making. From your introduction, you speak to me about this and Rob and that. I'd like to say that between us, we're nearly a fully functioning human, and we hope we can help.
Excellent. Do you have any confessions?
Oh, well, so many confessions, but I think for me, the collaboration is born out of this idea of new tools for new clients. And COVID has affected many agencies, many governments, and this need to sort of explore different ways and combined existing ways to kind of navigate the landscapes more effectively. So I think it's a well overdue conversation, and it got my curiosity going, and it's about building out those sort of tool sets, mindsets and skill sets to help regulators in context.
Nice. Thanks, both. Well, Grant and Rob have got some presentation slides to go through, and I'll just say from the outset, there's a lot to get through in a short time. So I've asked them both to go at breakneck pace to allow for questions at the end. So keep them coming in as soon as they come to you or come otherwise. But otherwise, Grant, I'd like you to start by just setting the scene for everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Look, I'm going to take you through 3 visual slides just to give you some context, because Rob and myself have worked with an international group on an introductory 101 type of workshop we'd like to explain. But the questions that came from 101 were more intermediate. Then the next week, we presented a full-day workshop on this topic to a New Zealand audience at the intermediate level, but the questions went quite too advanced. So we just wanted to slow you down, even though I'll do it quickly. We just want to slow you down and give you the frameworks that will be anchored in much of our interventions and discussions. So the next slide, please, is really, it's your placemat, it's your takeaway, it's in your show bag. What we really want to land with this slide is the colour coding. So hindsight, insight, foresight, oversight, just follow the colours. Red for hindsight, what it was, it's past, provides wisdom, and it has an archive type of view. So we'll reinforce these as we go through. So a simple 4x4, what's the question, what does it involve, what's it provide, what's the view, and we'll repeat this right at the end, but this is your key takeaway, is this placement. And the next slide, please. Again, same information, just presented differently. It's just starting to socialise how we reflect and learn with hindsight, but we interpret and respond to the current day, which is our insights. As we start to assess and prepare, that's our foresight. And really, I think for everyone, but perhaps most importantly here in New Zealand, is oversight, talking about stewardship and managing the system. So Rob and myself, see that as the whole system, the ecosystem, and that's why we love them all equally. But I think oversight has a particular New Zealand element. And the next slide, please. Again, lots of images, because we think images and stories will help you to grasp these concepts. They're not challenging concepts. We don't split the atom by any stretch of the imagination. But again, they provide a foundational framework for us to walk through. So Rob will probably unpack this some more about hindsight having more data and certainty attached to it, because we've got experience. Whereas as we go to the other end of the foresight, we have less data and less certainty. So it's all about using these sites, and I think it goes back to one of Rob's introductory comments about generally and specifically. I think this has general application, but also has specific application because regulation is regulation in context. So this is about looking back, looking in, looking forward, and looking across. So I hope those three visual slides with essentially the same information but perhaps framed differently, that will resonate with different people depending where they are in their regulatory role, in their agency's regulatory maturity, and wherever they are on their regulatory journey. Over to you, Rob, for the next one.
Brilliant. So I might just move to the next slide. And one way we thought about communicating this idea of bringing together an integrated set of sites is using a driving analogy. So we might liken hindsight to checking the mirrors, the rear vision mirrors of your car or the side mirrors. You're obviously looking at what you've gone past, but it's important because that's part of the safe car operation, figuring out what's behind you and what your context is. Insight might be likened to looking at your dashboard, the fuel gauge, the speedo. Basically, you've got a lot of information coming into you on that dashboard that gives you a sense about what your current state of driving is. And then there's foresight. And again, the idea of looking forward, looking out, looking to the horizon, thinking very much about seeing what's ahead, but noting that because the future is not certain, it's more like looking out of a windscreen that is covered with rain. The wipers are going, but it's not 100% clear view. How do these sites come together? Ultimately, for the operation of the vehicle, the safe operation of the vehicle, the effective operation of the vehicle. So bringing hindsight, insight and foresight together to move your regulatory system, to orient in the present, to make the next right move. Maybe it's worth unpacking some of the sites.
That would be great. As we work through the foresights, I'm going to let Rob work through them, and we'll be asking what the site is, how it's useful, and how it can be applied. And then I'm sure Grant will chip in with something else as we get going. So let's start with hindsight.
Brilliant. Hindsight. Right. So as sort of Grant mentioned, we're going to sort of take a high-level 101 approach to this. But hindsight is very much about reflecting and learning from past events. So for regulators, it's the space of lived experience, and from that experience, the place of wisdom. It's also about looking hard at the assumptions and the beliefs individual regulatory agencies might have going forward, and some of those major shaping events that have affected the way in which regulation is approached, or the kinds of capabilities that are built. The power of hindsight is very much, again, drawing from the wisdom of the past and honouring that past as you move forward into the future, which is a segue, I guess, into how is it useful? Well, I think it's understanding how those previous issues, that history a regulatory agency might be shaping its view of current risk, but also framing up some of those emergent future uncertainties. So having a really good sense of the history, the weight of the past, is really, really important in terms of figuring out what you might do in the present, but also what might be emerging in the future. Knowing the past well helps explain the present and helps you navigate the future.
Anything you wanted to add, Grant?
We'll have to be brief.
Yes,
you've got us on the clock. I just think when you were talking there, Rob, about the past events, those past events can be successes, i.e. we've achieved our regulatory outcomes that we've established to do, or they can be suboptimal or full-blown regulatory failures. And I think that goes into culture and those shaping events. So, why was the regulatory agency established on day one? What did it morph into when it was molded with another agency with a change of government? What does it need to provide now for the regulated community and society more broadly? So I think those past events are really, really important. And of course, one of the things we talk about in the workshops is when they are over-egged and they're privileged too much. So when I look at my notes from when we're in the workshop mode, I'll perhaps throw back to you for one last comment, if I may, Madam Chair. You talk about avoiding the overconfidence about predict, take action, that predict and act mode. That sort of, I know, was great for participants. So final comment on that.
I think some of the power of hindsight is actually understanding what is effective or what has been effective in that past. So remember, hindsight is a space of retrospective analysis. It's looking backwards. And again, some of the ways in which hindsight can be applied links to things such as post-mortems, risk assessment, evaluation of some of those regulatory events, and dare I say, occasionally regulatory failures. So I think that there's real power in that archival perspective that you mentioned before, Graham. I think the thing is, what it also does is helps elevate and highlight blind spots. This isn't about set and forget. This is very much about understanding what worked before in that context and why, to take that wisdom forward into what the next right move would be.
So listen, for me, I know you want to jump to insight, but this is the peer review. This is what you do in G-Reg. This is when you bring agencies together to say you had a suboptimal event, or there was a near miss, or even if it's steady state, what did you learn? So, yeah, as Rob was saying that last piece, that's exactly what your peer review work is about.
And I think what I quite like about the model, Rob, is that it takes hindsight away from that sort of hindsight's a wonderful thing. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. We can actually use it. And I know from talking to a few regulators, and in particular Bill Baker at Tamata Arawai, one of the things that he said to me last year was, you can never talk about your origin story too much.
Yes.
It is important for people to understand why you are here.
Yes.
And, that is kind of the ultimate hindsight.
Yeah,
was a catalyst for why we're here.
So I think for the Australian and the international audience, the Tamata Arawai is a relatively recently established drinking water regulator here in New Zealand, which came about after, again, some contaminated drinking water. But I like that. I like that analogy. Can't tell your story. We are established here because.
Absolutely. One thing I would also just add is that they often say that history doesn't repeat, but it reminds. So this idea of understanding those past patterns and recognizing them as they emerge and figuring out how can you utilize that wisdom.
All right, am I allowed to move on with that?
I'm just a panelist. I don't want to creep into the co-chairs.
I'll hand over to you, Rob, for insight.
So insight, the space of orienting in the present, okay? And if we talk about the weight of the past, we can also think about the push of the present. And this might be the drivers that are actually in the current operating environment. This is about looking inwards in terms of that transactional environment for regulators. This is the space of information, of data, the kinds of capabilities that you might draw on as a regulator. Maybe your analytics, insight, and intelligence teams. It's that place where you are trying to, like the dashboard on a car, get that information to understand what's going on and why. To be able to detect change early and build coherent explanations of what you might do next. And just sort of extending a little bit back from that, what I would also say that, the utility of insight is that it's a blending process. You're bringing together different capabilities. You might draw insights from the front line, from your I will say, headquarter or back office functions in terms of data analysis and evaluation. You might also draw insight from your network of stakeholders and your third parties that are part of your regulatory system, or co-regulators, if you will. So insight is the way of blending all of those various data points to try and make sense of what's going on. And again, how can it be applied? Well, insight basically builds off the hindsight that you may already have in place. It's essentially giving good information to decision makers to understand what is actually happening now. Again, on our sort of HIFO summary slide, we talk about the laboratory, this idea of analysis, of deeply contemplating what the data points, what the trends are, and then trying to make some evidence-based moves in the now.
I'm just listening and scribbling and throwing stuff back. I mean, orientating the present and the current operating environment, and that's difficult for regulators because it's not set and forget. It's really fluid, and COVID showed us that as well, how quickly our operating environment can change. And again, for the ANZSOG audience, there's the link there to our authorising environment, so we need to be mindful of that. My notes go into the trap, and you go into the trap because, we've just done hindsight, but we gust towards insight as we're talking about hindsight. Now we're talking about insight. Some of our examples are gusting towards foresight. Again, I think you're right though, Rob. Those insights can be tactical or they can be operational from across the sectors, or they can be strategic. And I think it doesn't matter what level of government you're in, local, state, federal. Those insights are local and national and international, especially if you have international treaties to relate to it. So, yeah, I just think be open to where these insights are from, harness them, but we need that diversity of those insights to give us that better information. And perhaps my sort of pushback question to you, Rob, from what comes up with the participants in the workshop is the discussion here about these new insights often require new approaches. So it's about experimentation, those type of things. So what would you add to that?
Yeah, look, I think that's an excellent point. Current insight will only take you so far, and you'll have gaps in your vision. You'll have gaps in your dashboard. You may have to run controlled experiments or indeed probes into the uncertainty that's surrounding you in the now. And, we see examples of that. So you might start seeing, again, pilots, regulatory sandboxes, approaches in which you can collate and draw new insight, new data and information to expand the options that you have. And I think that's a really key point. Hindsight plus insight, they amplify and extend each other. I think the other thing I would say is that between the two sides, you're starting to create the ways and approaches to build up a system there. What are you regulating? Who are you regulating? What are the boundary conditions? And how do those elements within your regulatory system go together? You can draw from what you know, wisdom, and you can draw from the place of information, insight.
I'm going to anticipate a question here, though. Rob, just thinking about it, I think the point around insight being blending together all those sources of information and context. Why is it so hard?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it is always hard because regulators are humans, and what we tend to default to is patterns that are easily recognised or patterns that have worked for us in the past. Sometimes we get caught in that hindsight trap. If it's worked for us last year, maybe we do last year plus 10% and we'll get that benefit. It's the recognition of new patterns and new approaches is the real trick for insight. And going back to a point that Grant made earlier, often new insight requires requisite diversity, different perspectives. It might be drawing on insights in places that you might not have traditionally done that from. It might be from the regulated parties. It might be from other regulatory partners or agencies within your wider system. Getting different perspectives might unlock different options. But it is a hard thing. We tend to default to what we know.
And just on that, perhaps by extension, because regulators are time poor. I haven't met a regulator yet who says they've got enough time, enough resource, enough staff. So because we're busy being busy, we've got these hindsights, and that makes us gust towards heuristics.
Yes.
The rules of thumb. Well, this worked last time, and we start to talk ourselves into shortcuts. So I think that's why, again, we want to slow people down and say, your instinct might not be wrong, but walk around and use all of these sites to give you greater options.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not go to the default shortcut.
I'll just extend quickly on that, this idea of sufficiency. We will never know everything as a regulator. But how do we know when we know enough to make a next right move? Yeah. So sufficiency is really important here.
So I like that idea of sufficiency. I'm just not quite sure how you benchmark. Foresight, right? You said we're already leaping into it, and it is interesting how each of these sites tends to tip you into the next. Tell me more, Rob.
Indeed, and one of my, you love all your children best, but Foresight I have a particular passion for.
Now we're out of time. Now is point and shoot.
But this is very much positioning for the future, right? This is this idea of the pull of the future. There are things that are emerging in operating environments, but there are signals of change that regulators can be increasingly sensitive to and start speculating and anticipating where things might go, whether it's changing demographics or disruptive technology. And all government agencies wrestle with this. Policy shops around the world are embracing strategic foresight more and more as a way of augmenting their more conventional contemporary policy approaches. So foresight is very much the space of imagination. It is the what if question. And again, this idea of layering your sights, building from hindsight, using insight, and now extending it with foresight. And arguably, this is also about anticipating the direction of the system that you are trying to regulate or have stewardship over. And there's lots of different moving parts to this. The usefulness of it, as I said, is around extending and amplifying what you already have with hindsight and insight. It's, I guess, in some ways, helping a regulator add another dimension to this in terms of preparing or anticipating a range of potential futures that might eventuate, and run what might be called strategic fire drills. The ability to kind of anticipate a range of futures, a range of scenarios, and even though they might not come to pass, actually building the capability or the lived experience of what you might do in that situation. So it's very much extending the reach of the other sides. I think, again, thinking about the analogies we used around the archive and the laboratory, you might think of foresight as the observatory. This is about looking outwards, looking to at a longer horizon, and understanding that foresight is about not just dealing with now, it's also about anticipating what might be in the near term and what might be on the horizon.
I like what you said there about the range of potential futures, because sometimes a conversation about foresight seems to suggest that you're just looking at one thing.
Yes.
And none of us have that crystal ball. So what you're saying is using those foresight tools to imagine a range of potentials and what you might need in order to adjust for one or other of those.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important distinction, Lisa. This idea of probabilistic forecasting, which is the space of insight, versus foresighting, which is, again, this is about anticipating a range of possibilities and implausibilities rather than trying to pick winners. Now, again, the idea of layering up our sights, hindsight, insight, and foresight, to give us greater options, greater utility, more room to maneuver, and clarity about what the next right moves might be.
Again, I'm just all over the place with my notes. One of the last things Rob was talking about, I think, goes right to the heart of one of the biggest challenges for regulators, and that's we want to be proactive because we get caught in the reactive. We get caught in the now. This is on the front page of the paper. This has just happened, so we go into response and reactive mode. Whereas, the foresight is trying to get us to, at the curve or at the curve like limit. So that came to mind. And I think that's what might be possible. It's not linear. Our regulation is not linear. Our regulation is not static. And again, in terms of criticism and frustrations for regulators, it's why didn't you see this coming? Why didn't you prevent that from happening? So I think that's where it dragged us. So sort of two comments or observations, Rob. You kicked off by saying about future and strategies in the policy shops and then our regulatory shops. I think we've also got to get away from being us and them. It's got to be we together as an us, because I think that's a big lesson learned over the last 10, 20 years is that don't have the policy people just design the regulation and throw it over the fence and ask operational people to implement it, is get into the blame game, whereas really let's get the operational people helping the policy people. Let's have the policy people seeing what's working as we debrief from those lessons learned. So I think it's an us issue. And I had circled foresight and forecasting. I know you said it, but I think that's worth repeating because that's a common trap which comes up all the time.
Yeah, indeed. And both are useful, but they are different things. So I guess this idea of forecasting is very much the space of quant. This is about assigning a probability and then picking winners. That historically tends to be relatively unsuccessful. Forecasting is useful to context some of the other insights that you might be generating, but foresight is something else. This is about turning your mind to anticipate a broader range of possibilities. The tools of foresighting can include horizon scanning, scenario planning, there are different products and tools and approaches that you might probe the uncertainty of what's coming next. To be honest, if regulators had 2020 foresight, there would be no regulatory failure. There is inherent uncertainty in operating environments now. So you need a range of tools and approaches. And what happens when your forecasting bet doesn't pay off? To what extent is the organisation prepared to a range of futures to ensure that it's more future ready than not?
And the reason I asked that question, Lisa, is I see a connection when I talk with regulators and regulatory agencies who are trying to be intelligence-led, intelligence-informed, and that use of data and analytics. It's that predictive nature. Oh, well, you got it wrong. Well, hang on, it's not certainty. So I thought that was just worth amplifying the forecasting, foresighting issue, because I think it'll have multiple applications and interest to people in the intelligence field.
And I think the thing that's coming through for all of this is that it's quite dynamic. So these aren't actually linear or hindsight and foresight. We're kind of working in an interplay and dynamic space of proactive and reactive and other contexts that we're in.
Yes, look, I agree. This takes me into a different topic, but it is very much context dependent, and there will be bounded applicability around these sites. So understanding context is very important. I guess one of the central themes for our conversation today is it is the blending of those sites in context which will extend the agency of regulators.
Absolutely. It's the use of them, it's the implication of them, but at the end of the day, it's the, the moderation of them and saying what to take away from them. But well done, Lisa. I mean, to get the strategic foresight guy on from Foresight in about 8 minutes, that's I think the way it's on as a success story.
So before we go to Oversight, anything else to add on there?
I think two quick observations about Foresight. It's probably one of the least understood sites, but I would hold of you that limit your foresight, you limit your options. And foresight isn't about the future ahead, it's the future in your head. Often we will not see what we do not expect to see. So foresight is particularly challenging for regulators because it is about trying to break the patterns of how they perceive the world, their data sources, the insights and hindsights that may have served them quite well in the past, may hit an inflection point where they don't. What do you do then? So it's very much the space of collaboration and diversity of view, which means connecting with fellow regulators, with policy shops, as you said, Grant, and indeed out into the world, because often it will be the regulated parties that are detecting those changes that will help you build the foresight that you need.
Yeah, again, see how Rob just highlighted your point fantastically, because we're talking about foresight, but that's without over-privileging or undercooking our hindsights and without getting skewed by our reactive, proactive issues in the insights.
So tell us about Oversight.
Well, Oversight, I mean, again, this is the blending. This brings together the three sides of hindsight, insight, and foresight into the space of decision and action. So Oversight in the context of the HIFO model is about that idea of regulatory stewardship, regulatory governance. How do you use those different temporal perspectives of past, present, and future to shape what you will do now to steward your system? And it's this idea of looking across. So if hindsight's looking backwards and foresight is looking forwards and insight is looking inwards, oversight is looking across the system. And this is this idea of a 360-degree regulator, truly understanding the system and using all the temporal perspectives to operate more effectively in that context. It is about sustaining that system, and it is the place of decision. And I think oversight is very much about, it goes to the heart of stewardship, which is treating your regulatory system as a strategic asset. It's about bridging data to decision. It's about using that wisdom, that information, and that imagination from the other sides to figure out what happens next. And a shorthand for that might be creating a coherent approach to ensuring that the system can be stewarded. So again, thinking about the archetypes, if hindsight is the archive and Insight is the laboratory, Foresight is the observatory, Oversight is the control room. It is the place where the regulator is moving the dials and levers, is effectively using whatever capability that regulatory agency has to ensure that not only statutory objectives are met, but the system is preserved and strengthened over time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, again, Rob, when you sort of say we've got the H, the I, the F, but as we move to the I, it's about the action, it becomes about the do.
Yeah.
So for me, the oversight that we're trying to achieve is our regulatory practice fit for purpose and doing what we want to do? Is our regulatory delivery sound and defendable? Because then it comes back to governance and what was the regulatory outcome we were trying to achieve?
Yes.
And have we done it with, all the top 5 proportionate, accountable, consistent, targeted, and timely? So have we done our do consistent with regulatory best practice? And yeah, like you, going back to when we met at that 2018 conference, I was lucky enough, Stephanie Winston was one of the speakers.
Yes.
Spoke about, I think the article that she wrote in the Policy Quarterly at the time was the voice of the regulator and talked about regulatory stewardship. And I know I've read it 4 times because I've actually highlighted it in 4 different colours. I think it's a fantastic concept, regulatory stewardship. They had me in hello as soon as I heard it. I think it has been a little bit opaque, and I know that Treasury here in New Zealand recently brought out some guidance material, which has been good and useful. So yeah, but the reason why I'm talking about stewardship, like Rob is because regulation is an asset, and our job is to leave it in a better position than when we inherited it. So I think that the benefit of oversight is to walk around these hindsights, insights, and foresights. But ironically, the other oversight is, have we missed something?
Yes.
And I think there's a little bit of that, have we missed something, as in terms of that version of oversight. I think that's my main points that I've come out of this. My notes, though, Rob, was from the workshop was more about oversight. This comment you made, oversight. It's the regulatory system thinking in action. So how would you explain that or put that in a greater context?
Yeah, indeed. So before I touch on that, I just might make one other point about stewardship. Stewardship is something to be managed and led, not solved. So stewardship is a very dynamic thing, which is why your sites will be dynamic as well. It can be points in time where you will rely more heavily on insight or, say, hindsight than some of the foresight tools and elements. But I think there is something here about action orientation. Oversight is about sense making so you can act. Acting in the now. And that's about, like the control room analogy, this is about moving the levers, figuring out what interventions and influence a regulator can actually exert on the system to ensure that those outcomes and objectives are met. So oversight is the space of action. So it's blending together those sides. It is not a sort of an esoteric thing that you're sitting above the system and somehow looking down on it and just pronouncing what should happen next. It's much more about action. So oversight applies at both an operational, tactical and strategic level. It also lends itself to system oversight, which is of course synonymous with stewardship.
I think you're right, and that's what I was thinking as you were saying, that you can't just be in the ivory tower looking over it. It's a contact sport, and you need to be, as a manager, you need to be on the floor, you need to be going out to the field with people to sort of, test, triangulate, moderate these sites. And the last thing I'd say from my first page of notes was options. I don't know if optionality is a real word, but you use it all the time when we're talking, Robert. But all these sites are about increasing our options, clarifying our options.
That's right.
Not limiting.
And again, I'll draw on a Cynefin use of the term sense making. We're making sense of the world so we can act coherently in it. And all of these sites are bringing a different perspective to bear. But they are context dependent. They are not all equal, and it depends on where a regulator is in a maturity cycle, the context that you're trying to explore. One thing is clear though, neglect one or more of the sites and you will neglect your options.
It's like a 4-legged chair, isn't it? If one chair's out of one leg short of the other, you'll be off balance.
Just an observation from me, Rob, and a bit of a plug. In G-Reg, we have a stewardship community practice. And one of the things that, in particular, agencies who are, just beginning that stewardship journey and thinking about it is we've got a strong focus on system mapping, how do you
Yes,
map the system, and it seems to me in terms of this whole conversation, steering wheel ahead, is that the map's really important.
Well, I'm laughing because, when you work so closely with someone, as soon as you said map, so take it away, Rob. Go compass, go map, go trail walking.
Yeah.
Give it to the audience.
Indeed. So look, we smile because Grant and I have talked about this quite a bit. The idea of navigating your terrain, which is the subject matter of this presentation here today, it's useful to have both a map and a compass. And of course, these sites can help you build a systems view, a map, if you will, of your regulatory landscape. But equally, it can help build some principles of how you might act if that map is not particularly clear. We must remember the map is never the terrain. We'd like to think it is. And Grant and I talk about tube maps versus street maps. I don't know if anyone's tried to navigate London using a tube map, but when you go above ground, it's not drawn to scale. So the idea of how do you use these sites to create a useful artifact that help you with the particular task you have at hand. But ultimately, this is about helping the regulator be that explorer. It's useful to have a compass and a map.
So this is why I think what you're advising and what you're seeing in G-Reg is so spot on, and that comes out of my consultancy work as well. You've got to do a mapping and gapping exercise to see where you're at. But to Rob's point, you need a compass, then you need the map, but has the terrain changed? So we need to walk the ground and see what infrastructure has been built since the map was drawn. So it's a three-part. It's have you got the compass, have you got the map, and actually then have you walked and ground truth the map. So I think it reinforces your G-Reg plan.
Thank you, Grant. I see we've got a pile of questions here, so I think we might just move on to those unless you wanted to say anything otherwise. Let's work our way through. Shannon, I'm not sure if we're going to take the slide off or... There we go. Yeah, everybody sit up straight. We're back and forth.
I know they can see us before, but it seems real now.
Yeah. We do have some questions and keep others coming in. Don't forget that if we don't get to answer them here, we will give some homework to Grant and Rob and get some answers up on the ANZSOG website. So I'll start with the one on top and compliment. This is really interesting. Thanks. This person's wondering how a regulator can balance making timely decisions with having sufficient hindsight, insight, foresight, and oversight. There's a danger of paralysis by analysis or the regulator being too slow to act.
Well, I think Rob started to answer this. I'll give you some thinking time as I feel a little bit silence here, Rob. This is what we talk about when there's enough information to make a decision, So this analysis paralysis is where perfect gets in the way of good. We never have all the information. We rarely have sufficient information. And regulation is a context sport where really agencies are established to reduce risks and harms and different things. So there's a predilection that society wants regulators to take action. But then, pardon the pun here, Rob, but then with hindsight, regulators can be beaten up.
Yeah.
So it's getting that balance between when is enough information enough to act, and if it's consistent with our principles and our guidelines, we should be supported. This is safe to fail. So with that sort of context, any deeper dives there?
Yeah, and it goes again to that heart of sufficiency that I was talking about. But I do think it's also understanding the type of decision. So that's about the context dependence of that decision. Is this a one-way door or a two-way door? Is this time critical, or is this one of those system decisions that might affect the trajectory of the entire regulatory system that you're oversighting? So understanding context is very, very important. I also think that regulators are action-oriented. So our default is to make calls, get on there and do what the regulator's been set up to do. But I think there is always a risk too that if you don't take that some time to reflect around what patterns are we seeing emerging from the past, what are the data points in the now, and what is a range of plausible futures, if you don't take a breath or a moment to kind of contemplate that, you run the risk of lack of coherence. The decision might make sense in that context as an individual decision point, but when you elevate back up, you'll see that it's actually detracting from what you're trying to do as a regulatory system. It is a balancing act, but context dependent.
So what else I'd say there, Lisa, is apparently I was right. I do. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about four Ds. So one is the first decision in its own right. Mm-hmm. Then it's about discretion. Then it's about decision review. Then it's about delegation. So as we walk through that, does a decision actually have to be made? Or do we not have to make that decision? So, but if I'm thinking about the operational people who are on the, in the audience, we have legislation, we have our regulatory powers, we are empowered to make decisions.
Yeah.
Then the next D is discretion. What discretion do I have as I make that decision? But then, of course, there's decision review. Now, that can be informal, speaking to a colleague like that, and pull the lever on this, what do you think? Can I just test that with you? Or there might be a formal decision review mechanism in your agency, especially if you're about to use or activate a coercive power.
Yes.
And then the last step is delegation. Someone might have to be authorised under delegation to make or reinforce that decision. So I think decisions are multifaceted, and we just need to keep to our true north, which is what is our legislative and regulatory power and authority to make those decisions.
Yeah. Just adding to that, back to maps and compasses.
Yeah.
It's easier to make decisions with both a map and a compass. If you don't have a map, that compass might be a set of regulatory decision-making principles or heuristics, if you will,
yes,
rules of thumb. So understanding what you have to hand to improve the quality and outcome of your decision, even though we will never have 100% surety that it will be perfect.
I'm going to hop on to our most popular question today. Do you think that hindsight can sometimes be counterintuitive and cause too much risk aversion due to previous experience, or even cause barriers to regulators making future changes due to industry or societal views being formed from past experiences with fear of change?
Yes.
Yes.
Would you like to add anything? This is a sacred cow, isn't it?
This is sacred cows.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's no idea of pattern entrainment. What has worked in the past may not serve us as well in the now, and might actually hinder us in the next. And so actually recognizing that and figuring out, are these things enabling or constraining? And that's going to require a degree of reflection. I think risk aversion, risk tolerance are at the heart of most regulators. We're in the certainty business, right? So the understanding that the world is inherently uncertain means that regulators are probably going to have to use different tools and take different steps to explore that uncertainty. Because, again, our playbooks from the 20th century may not be as effective in the 21st.
There's a lot in there, isn't there, as a written question. I mean, so what's got us to here may not serve us well to keep us here. I think the other part there, Beck, is risk aversion. Now, again, I'm speaking to both bookends here of the ANZSOG audience and Lisa, you from G-Reg. So it's all about regulatory profession. It's about regulatory professionalism. But there's lots of reasons why agencies or some managers might be risk averse. It goes to what's the agency's regulatory posture, what's the agency's relative regulatory maturity. I think any of these, even though the question was anchored in hindsight, I think we could say this for any of the sites. Well, if any of them are over-egged or neglected, the machine gets out of balance.
Yeah. Very true.
Yeah, just an observation from me with hindsight is if I think about, the reports that get commissioned when something's gone wrong, and they come out and, so one agency has an incident, there's a report, and everybody wants to look at that report. And obviously it's easier if it's not your agency to look at it and think there are some things in here.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if we move on too fast, and that if we actually want to, that the hindsight, the timing is about when you start to think back and the distance between you thinking back and what you can take from it.
Yeah, that's a great point. So this is all very, very nuanced. I guess the thing is intention.
Yeah.
As a regulator, intentionally deciding where you put your attention and focus, making intentional choices about hindsight, insight, foresight, and oversight. And if it's wrong, it's still useful, because essentially as a learning organisation, you realise that in that context, that particular combination is not effective. What is more risky, I think, is, again, using established playbooks to deal with novelty and uncertainty and emergency change, because what you get inevitably is being blindsided. You haven't expanded your playbook, you haven't necessarily run those experiments, you haven't extended your options using different approaches, And there will come a day where it's going to result in something which is suboptimal for the agency, suboptimal for the regulatory system, and probably for the government in some shape or form.
And just quickly, I would add that, you know, in terms of lessons learned, we learn from successes and we learn from failures. I think the theory tells us we learn more from our failures.
Yes.
And that's why I think we do have to jump on these reports and look at them, because we have to get as much information and learn from it. That made me think, Lisa, about when we were in Melbourne in September for the ANZSOG conference, there was a plenary session and a breakout session on near misses. So, you know, it's about seeing these near misses, and but for the grace of, that could have been our agency, because we have those systems, policies and procedures in place. So, yeah, that would be all of that.
I'm going to merge a couple of questions here. So a lot of Foresight methodologies seem to start with imagining an idealised future state. Is this possible in a regulatory context? Is it really such an open space?
Yeah, I think some Foresight methodologies think about this preferred future, but there are plenty of tools and techniques. And in fact, we Trojan horsed one into this presentation, this idea of a futures triangle, this weight of the past, the push of the present, the pull of the future. Many Foresight tools are descriptive. Some of them are narrative-based, and many, in fact, work with a range of utopian and dystopian futures, both good and bad. I think the point is to try and figure out how you're extending the capability, the reach, the options for the regulator, regardless of the tool being used. And I think there's always an and, not an or. Foresight is not the answer in itself, but what it can do is extend and the reach and amplify some of the utility of both hindsight and insight.
And someone's asking what tools we can use. Yeah, what's your favourite?
I'm quite partial to something called causal layered analysis. There's a whole bunch of tools. For my New Zealand colleagues on this call, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet website has a range of futures thinking tools that was set up as part of the policy project in New Zealand. There's no reason why any government agency couldn't access those tools and see a range of tools being used for a range of different challenges. There are more than just one tool. It's not everything is a nail when you've only got a hammer, right? So there's plenty of tools out there to use.
And I wanted to jump on that because it's one of those trigger words, you know, when you ask the question, fair question, what's your favourite tool? But again, as regulators have been warned, and Professor Malcolm Sparrow was one who talks about this all the time, is when regulators become tool-centric, again, it's problematic and they're blind. It's the same for our future sites is it's a tool that can be used in context. So it's knowing what tools are out there, when they are best and typically used for good, not evil. And the question before, I was reading when Rob was answering, I was thinking, how would I answer that? And then I actually read what Alice Turnbull had written. Yes. So, hello, Alice. Great, common sense, as usual. And it's exactly what I was going to say is that this ideal future state I don't think exists. It might have when we were command and control, very prescriptive regulation in a linear fashion, but now that regulation is changing at pace, it's really what's going to serve us in the now near next type of concept that Rob talks about. So I think, yeah, what Alice said was right.
Yeah, a shout out to you, Alice. Pre-mortem, spot on. You know, that is one such tool. Turning the mind to what may have caused the failure, even though the failure hasn't occurred. So it's sort of a backcasting type tool. And interestingly, these sorts of tools are used with effect in other disciplines and other approaches, policy being one.
The other question, sort of adjacent to tools, is one of the most critical capabilities and enablers of best practice oversight, as you describe it, that we should be focused on building up.
Oh gosh, that's very much your space, Rob, but I'll try to give you a softer landing because, again, I struggle with best practice. It's only best for a moment in time until it's improved. So I think for a lot of the regulatory work we talk about in ANZSOG and with G-Reg, it's about better practice. Our practice is better this week as opposed to last week, next month, last month. So I think if we can focus on better practice, because again, that's all about capability, maturity and resourcing. We don't all live in the ideal world. So I think focus your arms on better, not best practice.
Yeah, indeed. I might just reference back to the article that was published before before this webinar. This idea of the triple peaks model, so the triple A, so this idea of being anticipatory, agile, and adaptive. And let me just quickly unpack those. Building the capabilities inside your organisation to detect change early and anticipate a range of futures. This idea of being agile is configurations within regulators to rapidly deploy resource. And that's not just people, it might be attention, it might be project work, it might be engagement with third parties, whatever, to allow you to quickly respond to whatever you're detecting through your anticipatory stance. And finally, adaptive. We are seeing this with climate change. The world is changing. Organisations will need to adapt. The idea is building resilience, drawing on capabilities you have within the regulator, and maybe even radically repurposing them to ensure that you are more resilient in this emerging future. So triple A is a very good stance, this idea of anticipatory, agile, and adaptive. There are specific capabilities that you might look to build and strengthen underneath, but I would suggest that those are important precursors for effective oversight.
And I just think in reference to the AAA and the article that Rob and myself wrote, maybe if ANZSOG could drop the link to that in the chat would be helpful for anyone who if there's 3 or 4 people out of the 400 who haven't read it. If we have a link for that.
I'm going to take one more question because I want to hear the answer. But just acknowledging that we're coming up to 3 p.m, so it's that some of you might need to log out before we say goodbye. But I did want to pick up on Agnes's question. Do you think that Foresight should include an ongoing communication with the regulated population, or should it rely more on data from past experience or elsewhere? In other words, how independent does it need to be?
Can I go first on that one, Rob? Because this sort of goes into sort of my philosophy. Things that I quite often talk about is I talk about the 4 KRP, or the 4 key regulatory perspectives. So that's like a 2x2 matrix where the regulator, top left, regulator, top right, wider community, and stakeholders. So I think we have to look at all of those 4 key regulatory perspectives. The same we would do if we were doing regulatory reform or establishing legislation or doing whatever. We have to look at all those perspectives because they all have their own unique insights and data holdings to test and corroborate what we're doing. So I think it's multidisciplinary in its nature.
Indeed. I might pick up on your point, Agnes, around communication. Foresight is a dynamic process. Ideally, better practice foresight would involve engagement with, and to some extent even co-design with that regulated population. Often the diversity of perspectives in a foresight project is going to enrich the level of insight you get and extend your options. So rather than relying on data, again, better foresight work uses data to enrich some of the insights which are surfaced through what is plausible rather than just what is probable. In terms of independence, New Zealand, in a New Zealand context, some agencies are undergoing or producing what's called a long-term insight briefing. These are a relatively new product inside the New Zealand government whereby nominated agencies are turning their mind to critical uncertainties. And as we get more experience with this particular product, we're moving from keeping things within the wire or tight, less independent, to more of, the richer insights come with opening things up and engaging more broadly. But one of the interesting things about doing foresight is that it is not about necessarily solving things. It's about disclosing and probing uncertainty. So one of the interesting things about long-term insight briefing is that you don't have to solve it with a policy recommendation. It's about servicing a range of potential futures for New Zealand and encouraging public discourse or parliamentary discourse around it. So I'll come back to it. Good foresight is an interactive thing. It's a two-way thing. I would say involving others will enrich the quality of the foresight. And this notion of independence, well, you want quality insights from the foresight work to give the regulator more options. That needs to come with, I guess, a certain amount of trust through the process of engagement. So it's a co-design.
So we've hit 3 p.m. here in New Zealand. Given I indicated we would go over a little bit, I am going to allow you both one final word, like maybe a sentence or two. So, over you, Grant.
the thing that came to mind, did I hear you right, Rob? You were saying possible, plausible, preferred. Yeah, so what came to mind when Rob was saying that was you talk about the three A's, the triple P's, I've come up with the 4 P's. I think this is about probing to see what's possible, to see what's plausible, and to see what's preferred after having considered the foresights in totality.
Indeed. We've covered a lot. I would just say and reinforce the idea of limit your site, any of the sites, you're limiting your options. And I think many regulatory organisations are already doing this stuff. It's just how do you combine, how do you bring it together in a way that extends your agency, extends the affordances you have to be a 360-degree regulator.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, both. It's really enjoyable always listening to you both. And I have to say I'm kind of awash in alliteration, narrative, metaphor, but it's kind of got me thinking too for some of you online will have been at the NRCoP conference in September, and I came away from there thinking, what's my biggest takeaway? And the general vibe was about communication and storytelling, and that's what I'm getting here. It's about bringing together that rich story, that map. I've got written here with my little asterisks. Well, the map is never the terrain. I'm going to go away and ponder that one, but. Thank you again both for your time, and thanks to those of you online for your engagement, your questions and your responses to the questions in the chat. So we'll be preserving all of that. As regular participants will know, you will receive a short evaluation survey in your inbox. Please take time to fill it in. ANZSOG and the NRCoP really appreciate your feedback. The next event will be held on the 5th of December when the South Australian chapter of the NRCoP will be presenting on body-worn cameras in the regulator space. For those of you from New Zealand who've been around regulation a while, you'll know we spend a lot of time on cameras on boats.
Yes,
yes. You'll know, Rob.
Yes.
So keep an eye on the ANZSOG NRCoP social media, LinkedIn and Twitter to keep up to date on all the events. And thank you so much for joining us today. Ka kite anō.